Okay, so it wasn't too long ago that I covered the Chancellor's pre-budget speech and basically sort of the conditions she was outlining in terms of what would guide her with her budget later on this month, on the 26th of November, I believe. And there was a number of responses by other parties giving their views on that speech that the Chancellor gave. Obviously, Kemi Badenoch, as the leader of the Tories, had a position on this, and she sort of summarised it and concluded it as a managed decline, which I think, in terms of my own view and assessment as to how I saw things, it was, from my perspective, quite difficult to argue with her position on this. But what I'm more interested in actually is to get a sense of what Reform's position is on this. And the reason why I'm focusing on Reform as opposed to doing or talking more about the Tories' position is because Reform don't really have a record, I should say, of government. They're a new party, and they are a party that are aligned with the right and right economic policy, I suppose. So this is more around free markets and capitalism as opposed to socialism and, dare I say, communism. And they've lent into the anti-immigration sentiment that is increasing within Western economies in general. So it's not just the US and it's not just the UK. It is something we are seeing in Europe as well. So most notably in France, but also I'd say in Germany, Ukraine, some of the Eastern European economies as well. And there are many reasons why this sentiment is increasing. But I think my own assessment is probably because people are finding things more challenging, essentially. And when you find things are more challenging, people want to try and understand why that is. When they feel like life is more difficult, or they feel there's a shift, and we talk about a cultural shift, that's something Nigel Farage has talked about, as well as in the US. Again, they may look for reasons why they might think that is the case. So basically, Reform, as well as many other parties, are positioning themselves as a fresh alternative. It will seem appealing to those that are tired with what we've seen from the Tories and Labour, who have typically been the government in power historically in this country. And therefore, as I said, there is an appetite to look for something different, to take a fresh take on things. And what we're also seeing on the left as well is the Green Party, led by Zach Polansky, is also gaining traction as well. So again, it's telling me anyway that people are becoming increasingly frustrated with centre position politics and centre positioned ideals. And now there is an appetite to take a fresh look at the economy. And more recently, in terms of what I'm seeing in my own algorithmic bubble, a fresh take on taxation as well, which is either aligned to a socialist position, which would be something like a wealth tax, or a more capitalist position, which is more aligned to a smaller state, for example. So let's have a view about what's going on here. Let's kick this off and see what Reform are offering the UK.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. The Tories and Labour have wrecked the public finances. Reform UK will restore them. For decades now, the Tories and Labour have suffocated the British economy, wasted billions of pounds every year prioritising foreign citizens.
Okay, so a lot of what he's saying is true about the economy being damaged. And it is true in the sense that the Tories and Labour have been the parties, arguably, that have been the cause for that, simply by virtue of the fact they've been the only parties in power. So it's kind of like stating the obvious in my case. Like you don't get brownie points for saying, okay, we didn't wreck the economy, when you never actually had a chance or opportunity to do so, right? And when he says it's predominantly because, or implying it's because it is focused more on foreign workers or foreign nationals, again, I think from my perspective, I've not really seen a lot of evidence that supports that position. So most public spending is in relation to things like the NHS, it's in relation to benefits. That is where the lion's share of spending or public expenditure goes. And typically, the only peoples that are eligible for that, or the main predominant beneficiaries of that, will be UK citizens. So anybody that has no rights to remain in the UK, the question would be, okay, is there enough public funding to ensure those people are quickly processed and therefore removed from the country? So ultimately, it depends how you contextualize this position. But as I say, I've not seen any evidence that supports that the reason the economy has been damaged, or the predominant reason it has been damaged, is because there's been a focus on foreigners over UK citizens.
Energy costs in the world and raising tax as a percentage of GDP in this country to the highest levels since World War II. Let's talk about the Tory record.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the high taxes as well. Now, whether taxes are high or not is kind of a subjective view. Like, what is high tax, right? To you or to me, and we will have a different view on that. So I would agree that income taxes are high, but as a country, our tax regime is actually quite relaxed, and that is why it is viewed as a tax haven for many non-domiciles, for example. So it depends what taxes you're talking about, and it depends what you view a high tax is. So I would agree that income tax for workers is high, but I would also argue that wealth taxes in this country are low. And I would argue that corporation tax in this country are low. So what taxes is he talking about? I would want to know. I suspect he is talking about income tax. And if he is talking about income tax, then I do think it is high, objectively speaking. But the other point I'd also want to make about high taxes is that if taxes are high and they are being used wisely, i.e., if the government is able to collect that tax and deploy it effectively, i.e., use it to grow the economy, use it to build infrastructure, use it to build or improve healthcare and social care, then I personally would argue that's a good thing. Now, where somebody may differ from that position, and I suspect this will be Reform's position, is that actually we don't believe the state is responsible for those things. We don't believe the taxpayer should be responsible for those things indirectly. And actually, what we would like to see is a smaller state where there's less social initiatives or there's less social infrastructure, right? It's more privately led. So if you are of that position, then ultimately you will view the tax regime generally as high, right? So it's a very nuanced position. It's a very subjective position. And it really is a reflection of your own personal ideals. There's no right or wrong with this. And I do want to make that point in terms of how he's phrasing this, right? This reflects his own and the party's own ideals and personal values and their own perspectives on what the country and the economy should look like. And you'll just have to form your own view. And if it aligns, great. And if it doesn't align, then obviously you need to look for a party that aligns with your own personal views on this.
They claim to be the party of fiscal responsibility, the ones who help us live within our means. They managed to run a deficit in every single one of their 14 years in power. They managed to triple the national debt and make everyone miserable in the process. And they blew up people's mortgages for good measure.
So that's all true, right? So all of the things he said is correct, I would say, and I would agree with. But what I think, again, as I've mentioned previously, is you have to consider the real causes behind this. And you also have to consider reform are unproven, right? So again, it is right to call out the Labour Party and the Tory parties for some of the failures we've seen. But at the same time, we need to assess objectively what it is reform are proposing and whether or not it will actually change course. Because as I say, from my own perspective, generally the main talking point has centered around immigration, and it's literally the first thing he kind of mentioned. So as soon as he stood and took the stage, the first thing he talked about was failing economy, and immigration, essentially, when he talked about the fact that it was focused more on foreigners. So for me, if that's what he thinks the silver bullet is, I think from my perspective, I need to see more that basically allows me to come to the same conclusion. And that's really what I'm going to be looking for in terms of this talk or this speech or this view that Reform have of the economy. Right, it's clear what their ideals are regarding immigration and what they think that's done for the UK. But what I need to personally understand is, okay, how does that get turned into applicable policy that actually improves the economy? Because I'm concerned about the economy, not the sentiment around who is in this country and who is not, provided they're here legally.
Labour are just as bad. According to Capital Economics, Rachel Reeves is raising taxes on British people, post the budget that's coming, at a faster rate than any Chancellor in 55 years. Unemployment in this country is already at a 4-year high and trending higher, and that's to say nothing of the millions who are not in that number because they're not actively seeking work.
Okay, so again, I would probably agree with much of what he's saying here, but these are observations, right? We don't really know the cause just yet, other than the fact that the Labour and the Tories were in power during this time, right? But we don't really actually know the fundamental causes. But also, when it comes to things like employment, what I do want to also mention here is that how unemployment is classified does change. So sometimes it will include entrepreneurs, sometimes it doesn't include entrepreneurs, right? So that is something, again, I don't know how he is defining employment. I'm assuming he's going off things like the ONS, so this is the Office of National Statistics, for example, or maybe the OBR or the Institute of Fiscal Studies, something that is like known to be fairly consistent with how they view things. So I will take him at face, on face value that is essentially what is going on. But as I say, the reasons why we are seeing this are not actually going to be known. All we can say is, okay, yes, there has been less employment, if that is the case, but we do need to understand why that is the case as well.
Does that mean the H-1B visa thing will not be a big priority for your administration? Because if you want to raise wages for American workers, you can't flood the country with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of foreign workers.
You also do have to bring in talent. When
we have plenty of talented people here.
No, you don't.
We don't have talented people here?
No, you don't have certain talents, and people have to learn. You can't take people off an unemployment line and say, I'm going to put you into a factory where we're going to make missiles.
Bringing the brightest and the best to our shores with a new visa regime. Bringing the brightest and the best to our shores with the new visa regime.
So again, this is something else I'd like to hear a bit more information on as they continue this talk.
And inflation remains sticky at 3.8%, well above the target rate for the Bank of England, which is why so many in this country are struggling with the cost of living. The cost of living is intolerable. The prices in the supermarket seem to go up seemingly on a weekly basis. We have rents going up all the time. Mortgages never seem to get any cheaper, and don't even get us started on energy bills, which people are petrified to even open. And speaking of energy, this country has the highest industrial energy costs in the world. There is not an example on the planet of a high-growth economy with the kind of energy prices Britain has, nor have there ever been, nor will there ever be.
Okay, so he's said a lot here. So the person that's speaking, I can't remember his name, but he would essentially be the UK Chancellor if Reform were to come into power. And he's made a lot of observations, many of which I agree with. So he's talked about a failing economy. He's talked about inflation going up and the cost of living being, too high relative to wages. This is the implication of what he's saying. He's basically talked about tax increases and them accelerating faster than we've ever seen in modern times since the war. So he's making a lot of observations of failings, right? And I think really what I'm trying to say here is we already understand this, and we already understand that the economy is failing. But what I would like to know, and I'm sure he's going to come on to this because he's building a picture now, right? But why do they think the economy is failing? And the only thing I've heard so far is it's because we've had uncontrolled immigration, right? So if that is the reason, unless they've got something else to say, then I will want to understand, I will need them to connect the dots for me, right? I will want to understand why that is the reason for everything he's just described so far.
So, the political class are running this country's economy off a cliff. Britain is headed for economic catastrophe unless we urgently change course. And that's not just me or Nigel saying that. The warning lights in terms of sovereign debt are already sounding and are already flashing, and the alarms are sounding. The 30-year borrowing costs for the United Kingdom in terms of gilts are already not far off multi-decade highs, and seemingly every week we hear of another global multinational that is pulling investments from the UK. As Prime Minister, Nigel Farage will restore the public finances and restore and revive confidence in the United Kingdom. Despite the best efforts of the political class, we still have an awful lot going for us in this country. 3 of the top 10 universities on the planet are here on these little islands. We have more than our fair share of brilliant people in this new era. We also have millions upon millions of strivers and grafters, men and women who set their alarm clocks before they go to bed and rise early in the morning to go to work.
If you're wondering why I'm smiling and smirking through a lot of this, it's because he talks about the political class and the failings of the political class, and it kind of mirrors what I'm trying to say here. Firstly, they are also the political class. The difference between them and the people they're criticizing is that they've not been in government, right? So it's a bit like, okay, we're not part of the political class because we've never been in power, but actually you are politicians or politicians elect. So in my view, you are also part of the political class. And if you do come into power, you will become politicians, right? You'll become, serving members of the ruling government. And it's this paradox and this conflict that we also saw with Donald Trump, actually. And a lot of what Reform do kind of feels like it's following that playbook, where it's like, okay, we are the outsiders, we are the underdogs, we are the anti-establishment, we are with the people, the people's champions, so to speak. But actually, you're not. You just aren't in power yet. That's the only difference between the people you're classifying as the political class and yourselves, really, ultimately. So that's sort of the subjective observation I'm making here about this characterization of themselves versus the old guard. So I do find it quite amusing.
And I promise you this, as Prime Minister, Nigel Farage will be their champion.
Okay, so basically, dear Yusuf was the first to speak at the Reform speech around their vision for the UK. We heard a lot of observations from him regarding the state of the economy, how it's been in decline, and how there's been a focus, and part of that decline being that there's been a focus on foreign workers. And obviously the symptoms of that, as far as he's concerned, is that that's led to economic stagnation, inflation not coming down to the 2% the Bank of England would like, and basically just challenges around the cost of living more generally. So these are all sort of talking points Reform have made for quite some time now. These are observations that many people have made, including the Tories and any other opposition parties as well. But I think for me, we've not really got enough meat there or substance there in terms of, okay, well, what are the ultimate causes of what we're seeing? Because as I've mentioned previously, if he keeps talking about migration or uncontrolled migration or a focus on foreign workers, that is one of many, many symptoms with respect to what is going on within economy. And I think for me, as I say, I've not really heard enough that tells me that that is the thing, that if you focus on that one thing, that suddenly you then end up fixing the economy, right? So I think for me, it's interesting what he had to say, predominantly because if Reform come into power, he would be the UK Chancellor most likely. But ultimately, it's just a warm up to the main act, which is Nigel Farage. That is ultimately what we want to see and what he has to say. And I think it is kind of indicative of the fact that, despite the fact I'm very familiar with Zia's face, I did initially struggle to identify who he was. And I do struggle to think about any other members of the Reform Party actually outside of Nigel Farage. So I do think they do have to think about that actually, because I think it was something the Tories suffered from with respect to Boris. You know, Boris was this massive personality. He had a lot of charisma, and I think that is largely the reason why the Tories won by a landslide when he was Prime Minister. But then as soon as he went away, the Tories have have struggled to grab the hearts of the nation, so to speak. I've got a separate talk, in response to what Nigel has outlined, which I'll post separately. But I did think that this video needed attention on Zia specifically, just because he did actually say quite a lot. But from my perspective, a lot of it was led and framed through his own personal and Reform's own ideology and beliefs around what an economy should look like, rather than actual facts and evidence. So until next time, let me know what you think. But until then, as I say, take care. Peace.